although I will say that there's going to be plenty of time to ask questions and discuss comments and thoughts with our three panelists here. Thank you all so much for coming, for taking time out of your afternoon. I know it's a really busy time of the semester, so thank you so much for joining us. This discussion forum is co-hosted by the ACRL Instruction Section and the ACRL Student Learning and Information Literacy Committee. So I'd like to thank both of those groups for their support in putting together this webinar. This is the first of two sessions that we will be discussing the scholarship of teaching and learning, and it's part of a bigger discussion that a few of us have been trying to create on Twitter and just out there in the world. I don't even know if I introduced myself, but I'm Melissa Mallon, and I'm joined today by Kara Bradley, Nancy Chick, and Margie McMillan. And a few of us were on a Scholarship of Teaching and Learning panel at ACRL, and I see a bunch of names on the attendee list who I'm pretty sure were in the audience. So hopefully we can keep some of the discussion going from that really engaging session. And we are also talking online with the hashtag librariansodal, and so just put that in the chat. So if you want to tweet your thoughts or questions, I'll be monitoring Twitter during the discussion today, but again, feel free to use the chat box. And I will now turn it over to Kara. Thank you all again for being here, and looking forward to a great discussion.
So hello, everyone. My name is Kara Bradley, and each of us, we're going to just take a minute here to introduce ourselves. So I am a librarian at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, Canada, just kind of above North Dakota, Montana, for those of you in the States. And I became interested in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning during a secondment to my institution's Teaching and Learning Center. I started to learn more about SOTL, as we call it, and saw that faculty were engaging in these kinds of research projects, that they were also getting funding for engaging in these kinds of research projects, and thought this is something that is very relevant, has a lot of potential for librarians. So that's just a bit on how I got interested in SOTL, and I will now turn it over to Nancy to introduce herself.
Great. I am Nancy Chick. I'm at the University of Calgary, which is in Calgary, Alberta, which I'll follow Kara's lead, is just north of Montana. Let's see, I'm the University Chair of Teaching and Learning here at UCalgary. I'm also pretty heavily active in the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or ISOTL. What else? Oh, I'm one of the biggest cheerleaders and fans for librarians. So I am among my favorite people here.
Yay, thank you for joining us.
I'm Margie McMillan, and I'm first going to add a little bit to Nancy Chick's bio. She's also one of the co-editors of Teaching and Learning Inquiry, and has been a very generous mentor and leader in SOTL for a lot of us newer to the field. My name is Margie McMillan. I'm at Mount Royal University, also in Calgary, between the University of Calgary and Montana. I guess it's close enough. I have been a librarian doing information literacy for 30 years and doing SOTL for about 15 years of that. A lot of that time without knowing it. Was interested in student learning and interested in investigating it a little more rigorously. And it turns out that's called SOTL to some extent. And so I've been working on my passion, which is bringing SOTL and information literacy closer together and finding other people who are doing the same thing along the way. And so here's hoping we can build some momentum and take this further on. Before we get started, I do want to give a shout out to Rhonda Huisman, Lauren Hayes, and Melissa Mallon again. Our host was also part of this panel at ACRL, and a lot of the material that we're drawing on particularly Kara and I, was developed by our group for that panel presentation and in discussions. And some of it made it onto the panel, but that was only an hour, so some of it will be brand new. Okay.
Okay, now it's back to me. So a logical starting point, I guess, for the first session in this series is what is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning? Oh, people can, yeah, you can hear, okay. What is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning? And I particularly like this definition from Schulman, which you'll see widely quoted. The Scholarship of Teaching and Learning invites faculty to view teaching as serious intellectual work, ask good questions about their students' learning, seek evidence in their classrooms that can be used to improve practice, and make this work public so that others can critique it, build on it, and contribute to the wider teaching commons. So if you hear that definition and think, I'm doing that, that's fantastic. I think a lot of librarians are already doing some Scholarship of Teaching and Learning work without calling it such. So in other words, SOTL is an opportunity to approach university teaching as a lab or a learning space for inquiry, for knowledge building, for trying new things. It involves engaging with the knowledge that is already out there. It involves self-reflection. It involves public sharing. It results in formal peer-reviewed work that becomes part of the larger knowledge base on teaching and learning. SOTL products and activities, so papers, presentations, are presented publicly for others to build upon. And engagement in SOTL provides an opportunity for personal and professional reflection on teaching and learning. And one question that has come up repeatedly in people that I've discussed SOTL with, as well as in some of the comments and questions after our ACRL panel, were around how does SOTL differ from assessment, and how does it differ from educational research? So a few distinctions that might help with that. The researcher, first of all. In SOTL, the researcher is the instructor, whereas in educational research, you'll often find that the researcher is someone other than the instructor. The audience for the findings also differs a bit. In assessment, the audience for the work is the researcher and their institution. In SOTL, the researcher and the public are the audience for the work. And in educational research, it's often the public that is an audience. As well, the broad types of questions that are addressed differ somewhat between assessment and SOTL. So in assessment, we're typically asking questions along the lines of, is our current approach effective? Whereas in SOTL, we're asking, how can I improve my teaching and improve the learning of the students in my class? And whereas educational research tends to be, how do students learn in a specific setting or a specific discipline? I'll get to motivation a little further on, but just generally, too, to say that I think there's a bit of a difference in the motivation in engaging in these different activities. So the motivation behind assessment is, it's typically intended for internal use, for improvement, and there's limited external use for accountability. So things like accreditation, those kinds of things. Assessment efforts are often driven by external forces. SOTL is for internal use for improvement, but also for wide public external use in terms of adding to the literature, sharing knowledge base, productivity, and sharing presentations, performances. It involves systematic reflection on your own teaching and your students with the goal of improving learning in a context, in your specific context. And it's often motivated by curiosity, personal curiosity. So this is not to suggest that assessment and SOTL need to be two solitudes. Assessment practices can complement and contribute to SOTL. There is and there can be alignment between the two. Assessment and SOTL are similar in that the purpose of each is to improve student learning. It's not unusual to see a need for assessment develop into a full-blown SOTL project, and I've certainly seen several of those. And I'll turn it over to Margie here.
All right. So I'm going to talk about SOTL and libraries, why it's important and why it's especially important now. And I'm going to weave in a bit of my personal experience in this as well. I think SOTL is important because it provides an added opportunity for critical reflexivity on practice. That phrase came from one of the tweets from Emma Coonan in the UK, who is also involved in SOTL and libraries. And I really like that she brought in that notion of critical reflexivity. So it's bringing tools to bear on what we think is happening in the classroom to actually investigate and see if that's close to reality. It's especially important now for individuals, like many people. I've been in the game for a while, and for me, SOTL was an opportunity for revitalization, an opportunity for connection within my discipline and across to other disciplines, depth, and it really brought a transparency in my teaching. And as I move from thinking about the tacit to the explicit. And what I mean by that is now when I'm using a particular technique in the classroom that I've tested or read about in SOTL, I'm much more open about telling the students why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so it I think has, even just on that level, improved my teaching because the students seem to respond and seem more willing to play along if you tell them that there's a good reason why. In terms of why now for the field, we have a lot of new opportunities to conceptualize our practice. The framework has brought about the greatest flowering of discussion in the field of information literacy that I have seen in 30 years of watching the practice. And I think it challenges us to think about what is evidence of learning beyond standards when we're talking about these larger picture learning things. What would be evidence of learning in those contexts? And that helps us reconceptualize how we teach and what we ask our students to do, and ideally, how students learn. Technology as well brings new opportunities to investigate learning, but it's more the deeper aspects of learning, not just whether or not a student likes a particular module online versus in face-to-face, but what are they actually learning in those two very different contexts. For SOTL as well, there's a benefit for librarians because it links into larger discussions in higher education, and some of those discussions include the decoding of the disciplines, looking at undergraduate research particularly, and some of the newer material in SOTL as students as partners, which I think is very exciting. So it gives us an opportunity to broaden our horizons, I think, in terms of studying what we do and lead to improvements in learning for our students. So I am now going to pass it to Nancy. There you go.
Do I have it? Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about SOTL as a field. Certainly, you know, this work, as you saw from the earlier definition that Kara read out loud, certainly this work has been done by a lot of people for a long time. But it really wasn't until 1990 that it became this conscious, collective, named field called the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So I just want to hit on a few key texts, key voices, what you might call some of the early SOTL canon that gave the field a conscious shape. So I'll just briefly start with Ernest Boyer in 1990. He wrote a book called Scholarship Reconsidered, Priorities of the Professoriate. In this book, he looked at the work of the professor, the professoriate, but broadly defined. And he said, you know, we talk a lot about what is commonly called the scholarship of discovery. I do research and I discover something new, or I come up with an original idea. But he said there are other kinds of scholarship that we participate in, that we engage in, and that we can think of as scholarship. He talked about the scholarship of integration, which we might think of as interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work. He talked about the scholarship of application or engagement, which we might today think about as community engaged work. But then he talked about the scholarship of teaching, and he did call it the scholarship of teaching, period. And he said that the work that we do as teachers is scholarly work, and we can think of as scholarship. Now, he didn't go into a lot of detail about what that looks like and what that means, but he very consciously put that at the foreground, and lots of people picked it up since then. I just wanted to add to that. Notice he's talking about what he called the professoriate. So everyone, rather than just educational researchers. Again, to go back to Kara's point of what's different, what's one of the differences between educational research and SOTL, that issue of who's doing it. So here, again, Boyer is, you know, if you will, granting permission or tapping the shoulder of all of us across campus to be doing this work, to be inquiring, studying, sharing, and advancing what we know about how students learn. And that's really powerful, and it has really informed the field of SOTL in terms of the variety of expertise that's brought to the field, the different approaches and methods and methodologies, the different questions that are asked, and certainly the different voices. So for instance, my PhD, I'm a literary scholar. I am not a psychologist or a sociologist or an educational researcher, nothing. I bring my traditional expertise as a close reader of texts. And so that's what I bring. And so that idea of that this is a scholarship of the professoriate, of all of us across campus, is very powerful, and I think something we should not underestimate. Then, about 5 years later, Robert Barr and John Tagg published this lovely little thought piece, kind of a thought experiment, in Change magazine called From Teaching to Learning, a New Paradigm for Undergraduate Education. And this really is a thought experiment to urge a paradigm shift so that we move from that traditional way of thinking about what they called an instruction paradigm, focused on how the teacher teaches, how the university supports teaching or doesn't, how we design, you know, our classroom according to what we do. They really challenged us to push that to what they call a learning paradigm. What are the students doing? What do the students benefit? What is the impact on students? How do we support the students? So focused less on us and teaching and more on the students and learning as the ultimate reason why we do what we do. And so that very subtle yet significant shift, Barr and Tagg, that piece is really effective in introducing that idea. And from then, really, the scholarship of teaching from Boyer became the scholarship of teaching and learning, not just in name, but in this idea of, ultimately it really is about the students and their learning. Then a few years later, Randy Bass wrote this really well-known piece now called The Scholarship of Teaching, What's the Problem? And in here, he urges us to reconceptualize our teaching according to how we think about our research. So in our research, we think about a problem as a starting point, as generating questions of inquiry, as starting an investigation, as an invitation. But in our teaching, we think about a problem as something we don't want to tell people about, something that is embarrassing or shameful, or we want to just go away and fix it immediately or just kind of suppress it. And he said, we need to be thinking about our teaching as an experience full of problems in the best of ways, in very generative and inviting ways, to encourage a much more curious mindset, I guess, in thinking about our teaching. And so that idea of starting with a problem in the Bass sense is re-seeing how we see what happens in our classroom as invitational to inquire, to be curious. Then came along Pat Hutchings, her introduction to the book Opening Lines, Approaches to the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I'll talk in a little bit about the detail from that introduction that's so significant, but I'll just introduce it here by saying she laid out some important ways for us to think about the questions that SOTL can ask. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. And then finally, but not finally, Lee Schulman, really kind of the granddaddy of SOTL. In Lamarck's Revenge, Teaching Among the Scholarships, in this piece, he distinguished between scholarly teaching and the scholarship of teaching and learning. Scholarly teaching is, he said, what we all should be doing, talking to each other, checking the literature, making sure that we actually know what our students are learning. But he said it's only when we step back and reflect systematically on our teaching in a form that can be publicly reviewed and built upon by our peers. That is the scholarship of teaching and learning. And so that really put the emphasis again on the scholarship of that idea that we're part of this bigger conversation. And there are more, but these really, I think, present a good, quick glimpse of the history of SOTL as a field. And, okay, let's see if I can pass the ball to Kara.
And I'm going to speak next just a little bit about why do SOTL. What are the motivations of people who do this, and why might you want to consider doing some SOTL work if you happen to be new to it. First, I think it's useful to distinguish between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I sense in talking to scholars engaged in SOTL, and as well as from reading SOTL literature, is that much of this work, especially people's early projects, are intrinsically motivated. And I guess this comes back to Nancy's mention of the problem. I saw someone once said that the problem makes the scholar. And to me, this seems particularly apt in the context of SOTL. So, like Nancy said, there's often a problem, and you often don't really want to face that problem or address it, or it's uncomfortable. And SOTL gives you a way to own it, a way to own that problem, to investigate it, to resolve it, so that you're happier with your teaching and that your students are more effectively learning. As I alluded to earlier, many embark on SOTL projects, perhaps without even calling them so, out of a desire to find an answer to a vexing teaching problem and to improve that teaching and learning experience. So some of the intrinsic motivations and benefits of conducting SOTL research are improving student learning, showing students that you care about teaching. My experience has been students are really interested to know, oh, this person takes this seriously. They're looking to improve, and I think that they're, as Margie mentioned, eager to be involved when they understand what it is you're trying to achieve. It also introduces students to research and a curiosity mindset, which I think is valuable too. More and more, there's talk of undergraduate research experience, those kinds of things, and being a participant in a class where there's a SOTL project going on is another way for students to intersect with and see research in action. Of course, there's the professional development of you as the teacher when you're involved in SOTL work, advancing teaching in higher education, and it really does provide a way to join conversations in and across institutions and fields. So you'll notice the list of us that did that ACRL panel, along with Nancy, were spread all over North America, and I wouldn't have met any of them probably if I hadn't been involved in SOTL work. And we've brought in Nancy, who is not a librarian, so we're a community. It's a way of intersecting with a community who really care about teaching. Some of the extrinsic motivations include recognition for published or presented work and career rewards like tenure and promotion. So a lot of times certainly in my institution, and I think a lot of places, there's a sense that teaching is not rewarded in the same way that research is. And this is a way to really draw attention to your teaching as scholarly work, to create outputs from that that then can be assessed and evaluated in your career progression. I should also note that there are benefits for those who don't conduct SOTL research themselves, but read and learn from it. It enhances their teaching, so it also makes a difference. Even those who aren't going to do a SOTL project, there's a wealth of information in the SOTL literature that can help you think differently about your teaching. And I will pass it back to Margie.
To me. Hi. So one of the things that has come up in our discussions and in the ACRL panel, we didn't have much time to delve into this, is the place of theory in SOTL. And I am not an expert in theory. I reached out to Lauren Hayes, who's further along in this discussion than I am, and came up with some ideas about where theory fits in SOTL. And so there are certainly intersections, as the diagram would suggest. It's not a library presentation without a Venn diagram, with intersections of learning theory and SOTL. There's a lot of intersections there, and I'll talk about a couple of the theories that you might want to have a look at. There's also using SOTL to explore and understand your own theoretical assumptions, and then examining those theoretical assumptions about teaching and about learning, and how they might impact the research that you're doing and the lens with which you view student learning. And I'll talk about a key source of that in a moment. There's also, and I really liked what Lauren said about this, building communities of practice around theories. Developing a shared language among people who are doing research in learning and teaching really helps build those communities of practice and opens your possibilities for different kinds of research scenarios and projects. And finally, for me, it's also been a lens to understand the why. So some of the research that I've done turns up a fairly strong what is going on. But in order to understand why that might be happening, I've turned more and more often to learning theorists, to reading theorists, and to methodology theorists. I want to draw attention to the article that's pictured on the slide. This is by colleagues of mine here at Mount Royal, actually, Janice Miller-Young and Michelle Yeoh, and came out of discussions of a community of practice of SOTL practitioners here. And Michelle Yeoh is an educational researcher, and she brought that really theoretical lens into our conversations, and we came up with this conceptualizing and communicating SOTL, a framework for the field. And it goes through very clearly and talks about the large families of learning theories and matches them or maps them to research methodologies, because often we may see a mismatch between the research theory that you espouse, be it constructivism or positivism, and then the method that you choose to use in gathering data. So it's a really good starter piece, again, for SOTL. In the learning theory aspects of it, I did a quick search, and not scientific at all, I know. I went into Google Scholar, and I searched information literacy as a phrase and came up with 134,000 hits. And then I added Baxter Magolda, who is a theorist who's developed self-authorship theory and also some epistemological theories about student learning. And that dropped it from 134,000 down to 226. And granted, not scientific, but I think that shows that there is room for a greater integration of learning theory and other theories into information literacy scholarship. And I'm really encouraged by recent work on personal epistemologies by Swanson and some work by Wendy Holliday and also by Jackson on this. So I think the theories give us ways of understanding how we feel about teaching and learning to begin with. They give us ways of developing communities of practice to help us understand teaching and learning in our classrooms and conduct research. And then they may give us some backup in understanding why we're seeing what we're seeing in the results of our research projects, as well as in the results of our teaching. And so that's a very brief introduction to teaching and learning theories and how they intersect with SOTL. And I'm going to pass this on to Nancy. I'm going to switch the slide first and then pass the ball.
Thanks. From those theories or that theoretical framework, or how you think knowledge happens, how you think knowledge is made. From there, often come the questions. I mean, you can come up with questions in other ways, but the questions that really matter to us will often come from how we think knowledge and learning happens. And that'll become evident when I explain a little bit about one of Pat Hutchings's many contributions. But this is the piece from the Introduction to Opening Lines that I mentioned earlier. In that introduction, she will be quick to credit as well her other Carnegie colleagues, but hers is the name on the introduction. So she set out this taxonomy of SOTL questions. She said that there are really, right now, and this was in 2000, 4 different kinds of questions or projects in SOTL. And you can see on the screen the 4 different types. I've really highlighted just the first 2 because that's by far what we see most frequently, what most people do. So I'm really just going to focus on those given our time. So probably the most frequent kind of project that we see begins with the question of what works or does it work? Kara said earlier, I forgot exactly how she said it, but the idea of trying to see if something is effective for our students. What some disciplines would call an intervention or an experiment or quasi-experiment, but seeking evidence to see if something works in the classroom. That's really what we see most frequently. There's another kind that she talks about and that we see less frequently. And I want to emphasize that one. She called it a what is, a what's going on here. You know, you come to the classroom experience or the learning experience and you don't necessarily want yet to improve it. You're not ready yet to improve it because you don't know what's going on. To use Randy Bass's term, you know, the problem again, you don't know what the problem is. And so if you don't know what the problem is, you can't fix it. So tying this back to Margie's point about theories, you know, I'm in literary studies. My epistemology, my theoretical framework comes from that. And so my research, I'm really interested in understanding and describing and reflecting and showing what it looks like in all its complexity, student learning. And so I really am drawn to what is projects. So think about that as you think about what questions interest you, what you're really interested in, and what kinds of questions you actually can answer. Often, again, we jump to the what works without first knowing what's going on. So, yeah, so I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. Now, to think just briefly about evidence. I think Margie was talking already a little bit about collecting and basing our choices, or maybe it was Kara, or both probably, on evidence. And in SOTL, the evidence is evidence of the student learning. I should have put as well Peter Felton's 2013 essay, Principles of Good Practice in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. He lays out 5 really lovely, simple, yet significant principles. And the first one is that SOTL is inquiry into student learning. And so the evidence that we collect, we analyze, we base our research on, our scholarship on, is evidence from the learners. So here's just a collection of possibilities. And I want to give a shout out here to Angelo and Cross's classroom assessment techniques. You know, you flip through that book and there are a bunch of different ways you can collect really good, really rich evidence of thinking and learning from the students. So some possibilities for evidence: samples of student work, direct samples of their actual work that they do for the class, the learning environment, the workshop, whatever it is. Looking at that evidence of their learning is a really rich evidence source. I, for instance, look at their papers a lot as my evidence. But looking then again at Angelo and Cross's CATs, or classroom assessment techniques, those formative assessments that are small, that are quick, that capture a snapshot of their thinking, their learning, their mislearning, their confusion, those are fantastic sources of evidence for SOTL projects. Also thinking about how students think, capturing some of that process of thinking, not just the final product or performance, but that process. Process logs, somehow capturing that moment before they get to the end. Then, of course, scores like on quizzes or exams, counts, how many times do they come to the desk, how many pages have they written. Institutional research data, of course, can be helpful. And last, I put student self-reports of learning a bit, that's kind of a trick there, because certainly interviews, focus groups, and surveys absolutely can provide rich, meaningful evidence of student learning, but as I think it was Margie earlier talked about, often what we see are surveys of student preferences. Do they like this activity online or face-to-face better? Now that's important information, but notice that it doesn't tell us if they learned, how they learned, what prevented them from learning, etc. So think about evidence of their actual learning from your practice. And this is just, oh yes, the critical incident questionnaire from Brookfield. That's another great way to collect evidence. Good. Okay. I am now going to pass it to Margie.
Excellent. So I'm going to talk about SOTL-informed practices, and really this is just a very quick sneak preview of what we're going to be going into much more deeply in the webinar part 2. There's two ways of thinking about SOTL in information literacy. You can use it, use the literature for a number of purposes, or you can do it. So using SOTL really has helped me broaden my understanding of teaching outside of libraries. There is a lot of SOTL work on flipped classrooms, on group discussions, on active learning, on problem-based learning that isn't done anywhere near a library, but yet has a lot of material that may be applicable to the information literacy context, either in the conclusions that they've drawn, but also in how they studied it, what kind of evidence they gathered, what kind of methods they used, and what they found significant. So there's a fair bit of reading and research that may be closer to information literacy, but I would encourage people to read outside their species. Get beyond the information literacy materials and just look at the type of learning you want to investigate, and then worry about whether it translates to a library or not. And use that information to inform your practice and make little changes. It's a really good first step on the way to SOTL. Doing SOTL actually links to this because I think there's a lot of room in SOTL for different studies to be replicated in new contexts as a springboard. So there's a lot of the single classroom SOTL that was done once in an English class in Peoria, Illinois in 2016. And nobody's tried to do the same sort of thing in their own classrooms. And I think there's a lot of room for that. It doesn't have to be a direct parallel study. These studies can also work as springboards and give us ideas for practices as well as research projects that we might not have thought of yet, as well as I said, how they gathered evidence about the effect on their learners and whether or not that would work for us. But we're going to go into that in much more detail in the next webinar. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Kara, who's going to talk about more things to do with SOTL.
So by now, we've got you. You're captivated. You're interested in SOTL. You want to learn more, and we can help you with that. So you may be aware that there's a part 2 to this workshop coming up at the end of May 31st, and we're going to drill down further into SOTL in libraries, talk about practical strategies, some examples of SOTL work in specifically academic libraries, giving you some ideas, some directions if you want to pursue SOTL work in your library work. So certainly I hope that you will join us for that. We also have compiled quite a useful site of resources. We did this in preparation for the ACRL panel presentation, but we've been building and adding to it. I think you can see it becoming quite an ongoing repository. The URL is listed there, and in that Google Docs site you'll find a bunch of things, the presentation slides from our panel at the ACRL conference, some tips for getting started in SOTL, which I think is a very useful document, some cool SOTL projects, and a resource list. You can also follow the SOTL library and SOTL hashtag, and I know I can see on Twitter that a lot of you have already fully embraced that, so I encourage you to do that and complete or continue the conversation online. And finally, we are just issued our call for proposals for an upcoming book to be published by ACRL. And there's a few of us are going to be editors of this, and the call for proposals is on that Google Docs site, so that bit.ly URL. And proposals are due June 1st, 2017. And we're really looking in particular for case studies. So I encourage you to take a look at that call for proposals and think about submitting something. I think it will wind up being a very good resource. Our goal is to provide librarians with an introduction to key theories, research, and practices underpinning SOTL, but also to mix that with case studies of how these things are being used in the library setting. And I see someone asked, where can you find that call for proposals? And again, that's on the bit.ly site. So, and you'll have the slides for this as well. And back in the feed here where the URL was given. So, oh yeah, there it is. Margie has provided that. So really, I do encourage you to consider submitting a proposal for that. And with that, I think that's what we wanted to talk about, but we were certainly hoping that you had some questions or comments, ideas to share. We'd like to wanted to make space for some conversation around this. So I will open it up.
If I can just repeat our thanks to Melissa, Lauren, and Rhonda for working as part of the team on the panel and really helping develop much of the resources that we're basing this on. Melissa, do you have any questions for that have come through for us?
We haven't really had a lot of questions come through. There's been some good sharing of especially some of the evidence that has been created. We did have one question that wasn't really for the panelists, but Christine had mentioned using a critical incident questionnaire at the end of her instruction sessions, and there was some questions and thoughts that hopefully she could share that. So Christine, if you're still around, that would be awesome. And we did just have a question come in. What if a librarian only has an opportunity to teach OneShots? Would SOTL still be useful? And then I'll kind of add a little follow-up. How might it be useful?
I can start with that. Yes, absolutely. I think the OneShots are just as ripe a ground, and it's an area where librarians are used to analyzing what Nancy calls thin slices of instruction and teaching and learning, and it's because we often see learning in very thin slices. So it really can bring some focus to a SOTL project. to focus on one aspect of that, and it's ripe for what is questions. What are students learning in the one-shots before going on to the what works. I've done SOTL projects based on one-shots, but I've also done them based on longer-term embedded relationships. So yes would be my answer. Kara or Nancy?
I would just say, this is Kara, and I would just say that despite at the panel presentation, despite the fact that there were calls for the death of the one-shot, I don't think the one-shot is going to die anytime soon. And I really see SOTL as a way to make it a better experience. So it might not be your ideal format, but it is a way to improve and make it a more rewarding experience for you as well as for the students that are participating in those sessions, even if they are one-shots. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of potential in one-shots for SOTL projects.
And this is Nancy. Absolutely. I'm sending through the chat a couple of resources. The one-shot. There's a type of activity called a lesson study project, and maybe some of you are probably familiar with it. It's a real tradition in Japan of kind of just how educators work together and improve their teaching and share their knowledge. It's basically a one-shot that's done collaboratively and then observed together and honed and improved, and it's absolutely a kind of SOTL project, a kind of SOTL activity. And I have to be honest, among the best SOTL projects I feel like I've ever done were lesson studies, which were one-shots. So I entered into the chat Bill Serban's book on lesson study and his website that kind of walks you through it. So yes to one-shots.
That's great. Thank you all for that. Christine is still here. Thank you, Christine, for sticking around. She has a couple of questions here. I see. Got it. Okay. My bad. I thought that she was asking those of the panelists. So panelists, what was the most valuable thing you learned today? But maybe we could put that out to the participants, actually. Is there anything that you wish would have been covered? Because as our presenters have mentioned, we will be back on May 31st for part 2. So for sure, if you have thoughts or questions on things that you might like to see covered, let us know and we can work that into the next session.
Yeah, certainly. We haven't. Should I tell them we haven't prepared the next session? Oh, I might as well.
It is 2 months away, so
not completely. Not completely.
So it can truly be responsive to the things you want to know. What questions do you have as you think more about this, as you as you think about embarking on a SOTL project. Certainly share those on the Google Doc or use the hashtag, and we'll be watching for them to incorporate those into the May 31st presentation.
Let's see.
I've just seen a question about the whether looking at a particular demographic of the student body, such as student athletes, and I would say sure. It's interesting. There's been some work on the fact that we consider our students often as a monolithic audience rather than a group of individuals who are bringing different things. And we teach to that monolithic audience while we understand that they're individuals, but we only have so much time. So I think thinking of particular groups is a really interesting way of conceptualizing a SOTL project, whether it's student athletes, whether it's first-generation students, whether it's students who are perhaps in a particular discipline but taking a general education course and might have different learning experiences or research experience at the brink of that discipline and general ed. I think, yeah, go for it.
Great.
And I would say that some of the people, my experience has been some of the people who are most interested in collaborating are people who are working to serve specific populations of students who may not fit sort of the traditional target audience for a North American university. So we, here we found that the Aboriginal Student Center, the English as a Second Language program are very interested in how can we better teach their students, how can we customize things to better meet the learning needs of their students. So certainly that's an area that is really just ripe for development and SOTL projects. I also see someone has said here, wondering if the process is different when you're either looking at a project for SOTL that has grown organically versus one that you start off with knowing you want it to be a SOTL project. One thing that comes to my mind immediately is the ethics approval process. So in my institution, there is certainly a difference on whether you are conducting research in a classroom for the purposes of just improving your practice, or whether you are planning to publicly disseminate those results. So for me in my work here, if I am going to do a SOTL project, I pretty much need to identify that it is going to be a SOTL project up front. Maybe the first time I do it, it's more of an assessment of something in the classroom, and then I do it the next time as a SOTL project to get that ethics clearance. But that's just one thing that comes immediately to my mind. I don't know if Nancy and Margie have anything to add to that.
That was my immediate one. And it may be different in different contexts where in some institutions, work that students do is sort of fair game for research. But I think starting out with an intention helps you figure out what kind of evidence you need to get and what will be the best way to collect that evidence. That said, I've been surprised by projects before, and certainly the kinds of things that we see may spark a future SOTL project.
Definitely. And this is Nancy. I just wanted to briefly go back to this issue of looking at different student populations. One of the reasons I got involved with SOTL is I was really impressed with how people who do this work and are interested in this work, they really honor the complexity of students and of learning. And so while in some disciplines, they're going to want generalizable or what we might call, generic studenthood, in most SOTL, we really specify the context, what Lee Schulman calls the particularities, the idea that all students and all learners are complex and diverse, and we want to understand them across these particularities. And so I think that's a really good point to raise, is the potential for doing projects on very specific student populations and how important that work is.
Speaking of student populations, we have somebody who's teaching future instruction librarians, which is a very particular population. And for me, when you ask any particular resources that could help new teachers for the one-shot, for me, it wouldn't necessarily be teaching methods for the one-shot. It would be what kind of teaching or learning do I want to go on. So I might look for resources if I wanted to have students working in groups to develop their understanding of something. Then I might look for SOTL resources on how group work works for some people and ways of teaching that. Or if you wanted to do a flipped method for your one-shot class, there are possibilities out there too. So it's not necessarily the fact that it's a one-shot that would constrain how I looked for information, but the kind of teaching or learning that I wanted to have happen in that one-shot, if that makes sense.
That kind of leads to another question that just came through, which is if you all could talk just a bit about student evaluations and how much, if at all, this influences your practice, or just even in regards to revising your teaching.
Meaning student evaluations or SOTL?
The question says student evaluations. I'm not, yeah.
So student evaluations could be a jumping off point for a SOTL project. If it's a student evaluation of your teaching, and there are consistent either good scores or bad scores, and you want to know why, that has been the genesis of many an interesting SOTL project. If the question is, does transparently doing SOTL in the classroom improve your student evaluations? I don't know that that study's been done.
Okay. Great.
Is that anyone else on that one?
Nothing comes to mind, although I'm thinking there might have been something, if you look at Trent Maurer, M-A-U-R-E-R, I have a hard time pronouncing that, from Teaching and Learning Inquiry last year, I believe. He did an interesting project that involved student evaluations, not quite directly that question, but related, but you can Google it, Teaching and Learning Inquiry, M-A-U-R-E-R.
Thank you. One other question that has come through, do any of you have a lesson plan model or template that you use? Or do you have any kind of design plan, like backwards design that you tend to rely on?
This is Kara. I would say I haven't found one thing. I've tried a lot of different things, so I do have, I have in the past used lesson plan templates. I haven't found any one thing that I always go to. I guess I've tried different approaches to planning the lessons, and it always changes.
Or if you're anything like me, it's sometimes day of.
Yeah.
Or during the class, too. I mean, I think that's important to think about, too, when you're looking at ways of improving the learning experiences, that you may have to switch gears in the middle of class.
Yeah.
And that could be an interesting reflection piece for you as well.
Another thing I think it's worth mentioning is my previous life was as a medical librarian, and I know there was certainly a problem in the medical literature of only positive results are reported in the literature. So they try a drug for a condition. If it improves patient well-being, it's published. If it doesn't improve patient well-being or is perhaps even detrimental, it isn't published. And that's been identified as a problem in the medical literature, and I would say that's also something to keep in mind in the SOTL literature. If, I was talking, kind of helping someone through a project they were working on, and they designed a great project, they did it, and it didn't produce the results that they had hoped. And they were absolutely despondent, that their SOTL project has failed. And I don't think it is a failure. I think it's trying something, studying it, and finding out that it isn't particularly effective is just as valuable to you and potentially to others as finding out that something does work, or lead you to new questions about why didn't it work or what else might work. So just to put that out there, that not all results of all studies are positive, and those that have sort of those negative results or don't show a benefit from a particular intervention also have value as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a great point, because ultimately what we want is we want to understand student learning even more. And when learning doesn't happen, that's so important for us to understand and share. So excellent point.
Well, it looks like we're almost at the end of our time here. Does anyone have any last questions that they would like to discuss?
Well, as I said, I just hope everyone continues to participate in the discussion online. So on Twitter, there's a document on the Google Docs site there where you can add your thoughts, ideas, projects, and let's keep this conversation going and really create a community for SOTL in librarianship.
Absolutely. And thank you again so much to our to Nancy and Margie and Kara for taking the time today. I know I'm really excited for our number 2 session in the end of May. So hopefully we'll get a lot of folks back for that. And again, the recording for this will be available probably within the next couple of days.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.